Hello and welcome back. I'm Elizabeth and this is Time Scholar, and I have a new background, but I'm very happy to have you here today. So today I'm going to be discussing, modern history. It's actually from the 15th century. So I'm going to be discussing the Wars of the Roses, which are civil wars that took place in Britain, well, primarily England, but there was involvement from Scotland and Wales in the 15th century, and it really led to a massive change in the monarchy and also the sort of monarchy's line as well. So if that is something that you are interested in, sit down, relax, grab a cup of tea, because I think this one might be a bit of a long one, and get ready. So the War of the Roses was a group of dynasty-related civil wars that happened in England in the 15th century, specifically between the years of 1455 to 1487. So it was just over 3 decades of intermittent fighting as well. So they took place between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, which were branches of the Plantagenet, sorry, I can't pronounce that very well, family, I'll put it down below. And they were fighting over control of the English throne as well. So it was all to do with monarchy and controlling England, because at this time the English monarchy just controlled England. Scotland had their own monarchy at this point. There hadn't been anything to do with sort of a union of the two nations yet, and Wales was a mix of royal lands and marcher lordships, which had a lot of autonomy in themselves. So they had areas that were controlled by both York and Lancaster as well. So Scotland was also indirectly involved in the War of the Roses, despite it being an English civil war, and this is due to their alliance with France, which is actually called the Old Alliance, but A-U-L-D, and this was on the side of Lancaster, which is how they were involved, which I will discuss later as well. So, as an overall, the War of the Roses was an English civil war in the 15th century that was all over the English throne. So, a group of dynastic wars solely over who would rule. So, there is a lot of discussion around, like, why is it called the Wars of the Roses? But this is actually a term that only came about in the 19th century after Walter Scott released his work, Anne of Gerstein, in which he called on Shakespeare's works. And this is the first sort of real notice of War of the Roses that we really have. Before that it was just called the Civil War or the Cousins' War, which will become clear later. So it got the name sake from the 2 badges of the battling houses. So the House of Lancaster used a red rose, whilst the House of York used a white rose. So if you know the Tudor rose, you'll see that it is a mixture of both a red rose and a white rose, which is the outcome of this battle. So the term War of the Roses, as originally stated, is one that is older, and this is due to when the roses themselves were actually used. So the House of York used the white rose from very early on in the conflict, but that wasn't the case for Lancaster. So the House of Lancaster actually only introduced their red rose in 1485 after the victory of Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth Field. So this is quite late into the series of battles, especially considering the war ended in 1487. So this is why it really wasn't known as the War of the Roses whilst it was being fought or shortly afterwards either, because the choice of Lancaster to really choose a red rose as their badge came far later into the series of battles than it did for York. So it is important to remember as well that there was a lot of context surrounding these battles. It didn't just kind of stem out of nowhere. So the War of the Roses was based on a variety of different things, but these are the 2 that I would consider the most important. So firstly, the socio-economic troubles in England that stemmed from the 100 Years' War with France, which happened between 1337 and 1453, so shortly before the War of the Roses began themselves. So, and also, secondly, the feudalism that was caused by the duchies that were created by King Edward III. So firstly, the 100 Years' War. It ended with huge English losses, with both in land and in men. So England actually lost all of its land in France apart from Calais, and this left King Henry sorry, I can't read my own writing. King Henry VI looking really weak, and it was a very large drain as well on the royal finances, and it led to an increased tax of the population. So as a king, Henry VI VI was looking incredibly weak. He was looking like somebody who couldn't rule. So that was definitely part of the reason why these wars began. And secondly, there was the rise of bastard feudalism, which also had a massive impact. You know, after not thinking that they could really trust the king, nobles started building private armies who didn't answer to the king, you know, the head of state. Instead, they answered to whoever would pay them enough. So it created a real sort of tetchy background, because you had all of these powerful, wealthy men who had a lot of power in their back pocket and all of these armies who would do their bidding. It meant that the king wasn't able to enforce justice anymore. Powerful people with money were sorting problems with violence instead of courts, which, as you can imagine, caused a whole load of problems in of itself. So this, then paired with Henry VI's weakness, made it worse. It was almost like a powder keg. It was a perfect storm for a series of civil wars. You know, it was an angry populace over being taxed so much, a weak king who had lost a lot of territory, you know, the loss of numbers of men in this 100 years of war, and then also nobles who didn't seem to have any trust in the head of state anymore, who were funding their own private armies in order to almost do their bidding. So all of this combined really kind of set the stage for a civil war, for the War of the Roses itself. So the House of Lancaster and the House of York are both very important, considering they were the two sides of this dynastic series of wars. So firstly, I'm going to talk to the House of Lancaster, and then I'll talk to the House of York. So the House of Lancaster was a cadet branch of the Plantagenet, again, I can't pronounce it very well, I'll put it down here for you, family, which meant they were from a younger or more junior line of the royal family. So it was founded by John of Gaunt, who was the third son of King Edward III, so he would have very little claim to the throne in that regard. And he was granted the Duchy of Lancaster as the king's son, and, you know, hence the House of Lancaster. So it was his ancestors that became the Lancastrian line and claimed their royal heritage through him, due to him being the son of Richard III. So that is how they were claiming their line in this series of wars and battles to the English throne. So there were three very notable, obviously there were more, but three very notable Lancastrian kings, which were King Henry IV, who ruled from 1399 to 1413. He is the one who actually seized the throne from Richard II, and he was the first king of the House of Lancaster. Then there was also Henry V, who ruled from 1413 to 1422. He won the Battle of Agincourt, which is a battle I know very well, personally. If anybody wants to know more, let me know. And Henry VI, who ruled from 1422 to 1467. So he actually became king as an infant, and he also ruled 1470 to 1471 as well, during a very interesting period in this series of civil wars. So it was actually his poor rule that really helped to trigger the War of the Roses as well, you know, with everything that happened in France, with the 100 Years' War and everything as well. It was people seeing him as weak, which really sort of helped people put their pedal to the metal, for lack of a better term, in regards to starting this war. So the role of the House of Lancaster is one that I find quite interesting. So they were the ruling dynasty at the beginning of the war, and they were fighting to keep the throne from the Yorkist claim. So they were already in charge, you know, to them they had no reason to be fighting, because they were the correct royal line. So it was actually fighting the war to keep the throne was their main priority. And their fortunes actually declined quite a lot during the Wars of the Roses, especially with defeats in 1461 and in 1471. But they did have a very brief comeback in 1470 to 1471, which is when, you know, Henry VI was ruling again. But this actually ended with Henry VI's death in battle, which also led to them having a very poor performance post that for a while. And then also the House of York, which is also incredibly important considering it was the other side of this battle. So the House of York is also a branch of that same dynasty, descending from Edmund of Langley, who was the fourth son of Edward III. So again, it was the same father of the children who started these houses, if that makes sense. So unlike Lancaster, there was actually a stronger claim to the throne through the Yorkist side, and this is through the female link, which is their link to Anne de Mortimer. So she married the third son of Edmund and gave birth to Richard of York, who was incredibly important as well in this battle. Sorry, my brain just went completely numb there for a second. And this was all incredibly important as well, as bloodline and lineage was considered incredibly important in the 15th century, especially 15th century England. In the royal family and in nobility and everything like that, it was lineage and bloodline that mattered most. So they also had some very notable kings themselves, which included Edward IV, who ruled from 1461 to 1470, and then 1471 to 1483, so both before and after the death of King Henry VI. So he took the throne from Henry VI after the Battle of Towton, and then Edward V, who ruled in 1483. He was one of the princes in the Tower, which again is very, very interesting, and sort of a story in of itself that also took place during this time. But he was actually deposed by his uncle Richard III, who was the monarch from 1483 to 1485, which is where the Civil War ends. And yeah, he took the throne from Edward V and imprisoned his nephews in the Tower. Not the best uncle ever. I'm sure many of us have better uncles than that, who wouldn't depose us or lock us in towers. But the House of York had a very important role, as they are the ones who actually initiated this entire civil war. They claimed that Henry VI was unfit to rule, which they, in fairness, had a fair whack of evidence to back this up at this point, and they won major battles at Towton, Barnet, and Tewkesbury as well. So they were a very passionate fighting side. So overall, both houses descended from Edward III. So one from his third son, one from his fourth, and through different sons. So the war was dynastic, and it lasted over 3 decades, which is quite a long time for a series of battles. So when the wars began, it was Henry the Queen VI who was in charge of Lancaster, and Richard of York was in charge of York as well. So in total, over the 32-year period, there were many battles that took place. This is kind of, the number of them is really up for debate, due to what researchers consider to be battles. You know, some lists consider there to only be 16, such as waroftheroses.com, which is where I got a lot of my information from for today's video, and others consider it to be over 30. It really depends on whether these lists were only including major battles or minor skirmishes as well, or, you know, uprisings. But one thing that is certain, no matter how many battles are considered to be sort of major parts of this civil war, that this is one of the bloodiest internal conflicts that in English history, and it raged from south of England all the way up to the northern border of England and Scotland. So it was all over England. It wasn't sort of just in one area. This is a war that kind of took place over 30 years and across all of England as well, which I think is very interesting. So there are most vital battles, in my opinion, of which there were 6. So these are the ones that I think really had the most sort of permanence in the war, and kind of really are the ones that led to the most, I don't know, events happening post them. So the first one would be the Battle of St Albans, which happened in 1455, and this was the first battle of the War of the Roses. And this was fought actually in the streets of St Albans. So Richard of York and his followers actually surprised Lancastrians and breached the town's defences in order for this battle to take place. And this led to several Lancastrian nobles being killed, and it also led to the capture of King Henry VI, which again did not look very good for him, because not only was he already being seen as a weak leader, he's now also being seen as a king who can be captured, which is arguably not great. And this battle is really seen as the beginning of the War of the Roses, and it opened the door to the Civil War happening. You know, it showed the king as weak, highlighted that he could be taken by force. It showed the entire house of Lancaster as weak, because, you know, even their forces were completely disrupted by the Yorkists, and they could come in, break down their defences, and surprise them with battle. You know, it is also said that the battle barely lasted an hour, and it did lead to a Yorkist win. which again just really was detrimental to Henry and the House of Lancaster. You know, if they could be defeated so quickly with their king being captured in under an hour, it wasn't looking great for them already. So the second battle, which I think is of a lot of importance, happened in Yorkshire, and that was the Battle of Towton in 1461. So this is considered the largest battle ever fought on English soil. It was huge. You know, over 60,000 men, it is believed, battled during a snowstorm on some Sundays. This was on the 29th of March. So already it was intense conditions, 60,000 men in a snowstorm. It was just, weather was against them. It was a massive, massive battle. And the Yorkists were actually given a major advantage when the Duke of Norfolk, who was aligned to the House of York, brought in reinforcements. And this actually led to the House of Lancaster's forces breaking away and fleeing because they were just so, they were outnumbered and they were outmanned as well. The force that the House of York had was so, just beyond what they had considered. And this actually was quite disappointing because where they were fighting, there was a river stream called Cockbeck, and a lot due to the weather and just due to the absolute fear that these men had, many of them actually drowned in River Cockbeck as well. They were trampled on, the weather wasn't helping, the strong currents and tides as well of the river was sweeping them away. So even in their effort to flee, they still died during this battle. They were unfortunately drowned or trampled on, which led to their drowning. So up to 28,000 men died, making this the bloodiest battle on English soil, especially if you think about when this was occurring. It was the 15th century. There was no automatic machine guns, there were no tanks. This was all hand-to-hand battle. This was archery, cavalry, swords, daggers, shields, you know, armor. This is not like a war today. It was massive amounts of men to have died in hand-to-hand combat as well, which is just something I find absolutely phenomenal. And this was a massive Yorkist victory. It actually led to King Edward IV being crowned as well. So it was quite early on that it seemed that York really had their hand, you know. Started in 1455, by 1461 the Yorkists were in charge. But the war didn't end there. So on the 14th of April 1471 was the Battle of Barnet, which I think again is a very important battle to note. This happened in North London. And this was another battle that was worsened by the weather. The weather never seemed to be on the side of anyone fighting in the civil wars, but both sides were fighting heavy fog during this battle as well. So this led to a lot of disorientation in a lot of the armies that were fighting each other. And the Earl of Warwick, who was now aligned with the House of Lancaster, actually killed their own allies due to the weather. They thought they were killing the Yorkists, but they actually ended up killing the Lancastrians, which obviously was incredibly detrimental to the House of Lancaster and was really exploited by the House of York. So this mistake, due to weather and, again, fear, led the Yorkists to win this battle, and they showed no sympathy as they killed the Earl of Warwick as well for having aligned himself with the House of Lancaster. So this led Edward VI to securing the throne once again after being temporarily disposed in 1470. And it was a major blow to the hopes of the House of Lancaster because previously to this, in 1470 to 1471, Henry VI had regained power, but clearly not for long. So the fourth battle I want to talk about is the Battle of Tewkesbury, which happened on the 4th of May in 1471 in Gloucestershire. And here the Yorkists were led by Edward IV, but they were intercepted by Lancastrian forces attributed to Queen Margaret. So the Yorkists intercepted the Lancastrians, outmaneuvering, outfighting them, and Prince Edward, who was the only son of King Henry VI, was actually killed during this battle or shortly after. We're not entirely sure, but that was it. That was the end of the male Lancastrian line, you know, and Queen Margaret was captured, and Henry VI was soon executed after this battle as well in the Tower of London. This was a very bloody battle, not just for the men fighting, but also for the people who were also involved. You know, the Duke of Somerset was an important Lancastrian leader. and he was executed amongst other nobles who were supporting the House of Lancaster as well. So it also led this battle to Edward IV being the uncontested ruler for 14 years. So again, the Yorkists have thought they won. They had 14 years of undisrupted sort of Yorkist rule. King Edward IV was the king. There was nothing to be discussed. That was until the Battle of Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August in 1485. So this battle took place in Leicestershire, and this was between Henry Tudor, who was leading the Lancastrians, and King Richard III, who was leading the Yorkists, because by this point, Edward IV had passed away, and his sons, mainly to note King Edward V, had been disposed by his uncle Richard III, who was one of the twins in the Tower. He had been knocked away by Richard, and Richard had taken control. So at this point, Richard III was king, and Henry Tudor, who was Henry VII, was the leader of the Lancastrians. So the Yorkists had a far larger army at the Battle of Bosworth Field, but many nobles actually withheld their support at this point. They didn't really want to continue these decades of battle. You know, not only was it absolutely awful for everybody living in England at the time, you know, there was a battle raging here, there, and everywhere, but these nobles with their armies as well were being battered by these continuous battles. They themselves were losing men in no matter which way that they were aligned, whether they were aligned to the Yorkists or the Lancastrians. And one very notable noble who actually withheld his support was Lord Stanley. So the Yorkists under Richard III led a last-ditch cavalry effort and charge against Henry Tudor and his army, but although they had a larger army, this didn't really matter, as Lord Stanley's forces actually switched sides mid-battle, and they ended up fighting for Henry Tudor and the House of Lancaster, which was an absolutely detrimental blow to not only the Yorkist forces, but also to the alliance that a lot of nobles had with Richard III. Because if one noble could change sides in the heat in the middle of battle, what was it to say that other nobles weren't going to follow suit later on? And this battle actually led to the death of Richard III and the crowning of Henry Tudor. It is said that they found Richard III's crown in a bush and put it on Henry Tudor's head right there on the battlefield. And this was the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. As we know well, with King Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, Henry Tudor became King Henry VII and began the Tudor dynasty. And the sixth battle, and the last battle that I want to talk about, which is considered to be the last battle of the War of the Roses, was the Battle of Stoke Field, which happened in Stoke, the 16th of June, 1487. So Henry Tudor, who was now King Henry VII, was fighting Yorkist rebels. So Yorkist rebels were backed by Irish troops and German mercenaries, and they were fighting for a man called Lambert Simnel. And Lambert Simnel had claimed that he was the Earl of Warwick. He claimed that he had claim to the throne. He was a Yorkist, man with a lot of claim to the throne, and he wanted his rightful throne back. This was all an absolute lie. Lambert Simnel had no claim to the English throne whatsoever. He was a pretender completely, but he had managed to get the House of York on his side. But it was a sort of failed effort anyway. Henry's forces defeated the Yorkists at Stoke. They actually spared Simnel. They gave him a job in the royal kitchens as a scullion, which I think is absolutely hilarious. And this is considered to be the final battle of the War of the Roses, and it is this battle that really secured the Tudor crown and the Tudor dynasty. It was this battle which was the end of the Wars of the Roses. So although this was an English civil war, it was an English conflict, Scotland and Wales were pulled into this despite, being different countries. This was an English civil war over the English crown, but England and Scotland was still somehow involved in very, what I would consider, typical English fashion. So, taking into account Scotland actually played a strategic role, a far larger one than a lot of people really account for, in the War of the Roses, especially during the early Lancastrian resistance as well. So Margaret of Anjou was the wife of King Henry VI, and she was French, and which calls back to the odd alliance I was talking about earlier. And she actually fled to Scotland looking for support, as Scotland had this alliance with France. She was leaning on the old alliance. And the Scots, who were led by Mary of Guelders, who was the Scottish Queen Regent at the time, offered her sanctuary in hell on one condition. She wanted the border town of Berwick. She was like, yeah, we'll help you, no worries, you can stay with us, we'll keep you safe, but, you know, for our help in our armies and for keeping you safe, we want that town, we want that border town. Which I think is very interesting as somebody who lives in Scotland. You know, now you have North Berwick and, you know, Berwick upon Tweed, one of which is in Scotland, one of which is in England. And, you know, it's very interesting, I think, that there has been a constant kind of, dichotomy is not the right word, but argument over this border village, town, which I think is just very interesting. And Scottish troops actually even fought in England during this English Civil War on behalf of the Lancastrians, especially during their early campaigns. But it is said that Scotland kind of, as much as they helped and their aid really prolonged the conflict as well, it is said that they were mildly opportunistic. You know, they were more interested in territory and weakening England and its monarchy than they were in sort of dynastic loyalty. They kind of were given an opportunity by Margaret of Anjou to take part in this war, so which they did. Wales is another very interesting part as well, as a country that was kind of semi-controlled by the English monarchy, but also semi-controlled by York and Lancastrian noblemen. It was very interesting. It also shows the role of Wales, I think, is continuous. But they had a very, very key role, especially with the rise of Henry Tudor, so Henry VII. So Owen Glyndwr, I'm very sorry if I pronounced that wrong, I'm not very good with pronouncing foreign names. I will put it down here, it is in Welsh. Had an earlier rebellion. So Owen's earlier rebellion was in 1400 to 1415, and this really kind of stoked Welsh resistance to English control, you know, and this was obviously not too far before the War of the Roses, so this is very important context as well. And then many Welsh nobles actually standed with York, especially William Herbert, who actually helped control Wales for Edward IV, which I think is very interesting. Additionally to this, so Wales actually had links to both the Yorkist side and the Lancastrian side, as Henry Tudor was actually born in Wales. And after his exile, so in 1485, post-exile, he actually walked through Wales. That's where he landed when he came back. And he gained supporters through his walk through Wales back to England, and he gained supporters and a lot of Welsh soldiers who actually ended up being a core part of his army at Bosworth Field. So there are a lot of Welsh soldiers also who fought in the English Civil War, similarly to Scotland as well, which I think is very interesting and sometimes overlooked, as it was an English Civil War, but the countries of Wales and Scotland were very much involved, and even Ireland was involved with the Irish mercenaries in the final battle of the Civil Wars as well. So although it was an English Civil War over English monarchy and the English throne and the English crown, various different countries were all involved as well. So this war had a lot of different repercussions. Not only did it change the entire line of monarchy, but it decimated the English nobility. You know, the monarchy came out stronger, and due to this decimated sort of English nobility, you know, lines were completely blasted out. You know, fathers and sons had died, leaving absolutely no line. They left a lot of sort of nobilities and duchies and, you know, land, power, really, with nowhere to go, which really helped strengthen the monarch. You know, the king now had to centralise power in order to avoid future civil wars. So Henry VII was less of a figurehead now and far more a head of state, which I think is very interesting. And they also did more. They blended the houses of York and Lancaster, and this was when Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, which is where the combined Tudor rose comes from. from the House of Lancaster and the House of York. They intertwined their roses to come up with the Tudor rose that we know today, the white and the red. And this united the country of England, and it ended any dynastic rivalry, really, because now any heir-to-be would be of both Yorkist and Lancastrian line. There was no more arguments to be had. It was a very clever marriage, although it was one purely for political reasons. And, these wars shaped the British monarchy. They paved the way for the Tudor monarchy as well. Monarchs that we know today and that are very famous still, Henry VIII, the first Queen, Elizabeth I, a lot of these Tudor monarchs, it paved the way for them, but also paved the end for them, as we know that Elizabeth I never married, and that was the end of the Tudor line as well. So the aftermath is very interesting. It changed the monarchy, and therefore it changed the monarch line as well. Like, even today, we have King Charles, but his line may not have ever become king if it wasn't for the civil wars in the 15th century, which I think is very, very interesting in itself. So overall, the War of the Roses was not just a battle between kings. It wasn't just a battle between sort of the House of York and the House of Lancaster either. It was a battle between nobility and commoners, knights, servants, noblemen, just anyone was coming out and they were getting involved, whether it was directly through fighting, whether it was indirectly. Everyone was getting involved. These wars really shaped England and changed a lot in England as well, the centralized power now being the king. It was a massive change. It was the end of an era and the beginning of another. It really centralized power under the monarch in a far more official capacity. There were still noblemen, and there are still, people we can consider to be noblemen today, people who have, a far more percentage of the wealth, things like that. But by consolidating really all of the power under the king, and especially in the marriage between Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, they really kind of brought that power back to a central, finite, overarching institution of the monarchy, really trying to make sure they put the nail in the coffin, for lack of a better term, of any other civil wars that were going to take place over the English throne. But yeah, this was a bit of a long one, and it was a bit of a soft overview, as the War of the Roses is an incredibly large topic. I will be happy to do another video delving into some of the other battles that I did miss today. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and if you do, please remember to like, subscribe, and comment. It really helps out my channel as well, and if there is anything that you'd like to hear, let me know, and I will do my best to research it and put a video together for you guys. So next week I'm going to be talking about ancient history, and I will be talking about the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, so stay tuned if that is one that interests you. And yeah, if not, I'm always up for suggestions, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye!